everybody plays games, and kids definitely play games, right? Students play games, and if you use that as the text, let's say, as opposed to like you're reading whatever crappy book that they're forcing you to read in your, in your school like curriculum, as opposed to, well, instead of this, like, all right, we're gonna play through like a section of like Breath of the Wild or something, and that's what you're gonna write like your book report on.
I was a bad student and I didn't do any of those. So I just
Yeah.
took the F.
All right. Well,
I
it
was not
shows
a book
drive,
kid growing up. I would have written you a report on Zelda.
but that speaks to it, though, right?
Luis Aguasvivas. This is an interesting episode that came together differently than all the other episodes we've done so far, because in this case, he reached out to me, which is interesting. I don't really know why he did still, honestly, but he has a pretty decent set of credentials behind him. He's a game journalist, and he writes for the website Pop Matters. It's like a culture website that has a gaming section on it. He's contributed to NPR and things like that. But and he has got a couple other credentials with some other kind of key websites as well. But the thing that really caught my eye personally was that he contributes to a group called the New York Videogame Critics Circle. And this is a group that kind of teaches kids in need, basically. So, it helps them learn various skills and things like that through writing about video games. And so that's something that, like, I have a lot of respect for, because obviously if you listen to this channel, a lot of what we talk about is video games, and sometimes some of that is like finding the meaning of like why we're even talking about video games in the first place, kind of thing, right? But I kind of want to talk to him a little bit about the game journalism scene in the modern day, because it's something that I tried but gave up on forever ago, almost a decade ago at this point. And I wanted to kind of catch up on the scene a little bit and just get like an understanding of, like, from his perspective, what it means to kind of be a game journalist, what kind of value his voice lends to conversations around games and things like that. So this is a very kind of like episode that's very much about like why you communicate about games and how you communicate about games. I think that's kind of like the big focuses of today's episode, and we kind of dig into that through a variety of articles he's written over time, and how his background kind of led to his ability to create certain types of articles based off his past experiences. I hadn't heard you before you reached out to me. I will say I have kind of gone down my own weird path that a lot of times I don't really engage a lot with like a lot of modern game criticism and stuff like that.
Completely understandable.
But one thing that I thought that it kind of caught my eye actually when I was looking around at your stuff is I did see that you were listed for was it the Long Island Retro Gaming Convention as a guest there?
Yeah, I was a guest.
Yeah, I was curious exactly, what did that look like, and like what were you there to talk about and things like that? Because when I assumed you were probably talking more about modern games, but I did read your like Final Fantasy VIII article and things like that. So I was kind of curious what your engagement was there. If you felt like if that is like the direction you think you're going into retro games, or is that just a part of what you currently do, kind of thing?
No, it's a good question, and I'll answer it in my roundabout way that I usually answer.
I
these
ask
types of
questions
things.
in roundabout ways. So,
So so first, so I'll start from the top. So I was there. I did a panel with Jordan Miner, he's a game critic and journalist for PC Mag. He wrote a book, Video Game of the Year, which is it's a really good book. It goes by essentially starts in 1978 until the present time where the book was published, and it's like one game each year. We essentially to it's like a to show like my admiration for that book, and also like for Jordan. We're both in the New York Video Games Critics Circle as well. Um, w- we we did a panel on that. I brought on Tim Rogers for that as well. I'll actually share that with you. I have like a recording of that. It's not up on YouTube. Actually, Jordan put it on YouTube, so it is up on there. But yeah, it's so you can definitely listen to that. It's pretty interesting, especially like Tim's stuff. When it comes to retro gaming's always been it's always been a thing for me. I mean, my it's obviously the way of like modern video games criticism. Obviously, you have to like try to at the very least like cover the big hot games. If you look at my work, you see that I really tend to focus more on like independent games. Sometimes like extremely obscure stuff, at least what most people would consider obscure, like HIO games. So, I mean, I write for the main place I write for is one of the oldest, like mass like media, like cultural criticism websites, like in on the internet, Pop Matters. And for that website, I'm writing about a game that probably at this point no more than like 1,000 people have like played, and like I'm not, and I do that because I think not only is that like worthy of being looked at seriously,
Hmm.
in my opinion more worthy sometimes than a lot of these ultra expensive games that like people talk about like it's like the greatest thing ever. And part of that comes from my experience playing games from a very young age, right? I get as much pleasure from playing something that came out on the NES, on the Famicom, or any or whatever other retro console, um, as I can from a modern. And for me as a critic too, it's very important that I understand like the history of video games, not just specifically the history of video games, like in as like a monolith, but also like even things around it when it comes to technology, cultural, cultural currents of the time, etc. Like I mean, I'll say this like aspirationally, right? Like I'm very much like a critic in the sense of I don't do consumer reviews, right?
Hmm.
I'm not gonna be somebody that's gonna tell you like should you buy the game or not,
Yeah,
or is
Madden
it.
8.2.
Yeah, I don't do rate. I mean, sometimes like my editor will put like a rating like for a game of my for a review. I mean, that's usually like that's not like I don't do that. Like I mean I write and words have meaning. Like that's a I mean, sorry if sometimes the reviews are too long. Sorry if sometimes the reviews are too short. But it is what it is. And so retro gaming to me, I don't even I know that there's like a division of it. I know like why it exists, right? It's like, oh, there's retro gaming, there's modern gaming, etc. Obviously there's like time periods, there's like hardware specificities, right? Increasingly so there's actual like difficulty of actually accessing like software, like playing games. um so all these things are there and should be talked about, but there's more new games. I mean, there's more old games that I haven't played than new games, So it's like, so I don't look at it in that linear like aspect of it. I mean, sometimes it can be painful though, because some games are obviously like they're not the very some of the very first like video games, especially when it comes to like genre specific. These can be very difficult to play now if you played some of the modern stuff, but
Yeah.
there's still enjoyment to be found.
Do you think so I do think, you kind of identified a little bit there is a split there. Like I feel like there are people who are like if a video game didn't come out this year, it's not relevant kind of thing. Not in a malicious way, but in terms of like, what they're interested in, right? And then some people, I think will completely cut off modern games and say I don't want to talk about whatever game, I just want to focus on I really like the Sega Saturn, so I'm really going to focus on the Sega Saturn kind of thing, right? Um, when you were growing up, I think one of the articles I read from you talked about your experience with like game magazines and the Wind Waker a little bit. Um, and correct me if I'm wrong, is Pop Matters a website that is a general culture website versus like a game specific website? Like I think they do more than just games, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
definitely. Like, so it's mainly so Pop Matters is mainly known for music criticism. Um, I actually help like bring back like the gaming section. Um, I mean, I've been writing about games there for over 2 years now, but it wasn't until a few months ago that we brought back like the gaming sub tab like on the main page.
do you think the game coverage you were seeing growing up and things like that kind of inform that kind of like willingness to kind of go either with the modern game or older games kind of thing? Like any of the magazines you reading kind of informing that more broad approach, do you feel like? Doesn't even have
Um,
to be game magazines. It could be anything if you feel like
yeah,
that might
no,
play a role.
that's a good question. And I think that that article you're referring to is it's the I think it was the first person scholar one. The reason why I brought this up is like so I actually submitted that article like a year and a half ago. So I actually didn't when it was published. I forgot that it was that it was a
Yeah.
thing. So I'm just yeah. Yeah, I think partly so, but when I was really engaged as like a reader of like games magazines, it was very much in a sense of there wasn't really that many other ways, at least for me, to like engage with things that haven't come out or games that I wasn't able to play for whatever reason. Um, I mean now it's a little different, but it's so that was mainly it. Like I would play it, I would play these games like in my head, or it's like if I really love the game, which most of the games that I would have at the time I would because I wouldn't have that many of them, right? I would try to get supplementary, like like paratext. It's I think that's it's one way of like describing them that like discuss it, like give me like a playthrough, like secrets and everything, or like art because I just wanted to like be like more into that world. Um, so about the retro question on it, I mean, not. I don't think that's necessarily it. That's I wouldn't say the magazines themselves because I think a lot of the magazines were pretty much also not too dissimilar to like the general climate now. Of I'm talking about like mass media, like very like publications. It's just what's new, like what's like the hottest thing. On occasion you might get like a retrospective or like a feature, but
I think for me, like one thing I have been trying to think a lot more about is like how much Nintendo informed like my value with games, basically. Because I was like a hardcore Nintendo fan growing up. And it was probably when I was around 18 that that really started to crack and I started doing other things for a lot of different reasons. But I sometimes I wonder if like part of the reason why I do take like a more broader view to games is I feel like in the early 2000s, Nintendo was really starting to focus a little bit more on their retro catalog, right? You had like those Game Boy Advance re releases and things like that that were coming out, re releasing these old games. And that's not to say it didn't exist before, right? You have the Mario collection and things like that. So part of me wonders if like that kind of led into me taking an interest in that stuff a little more than if, I had grown up a few years earlier kind of thing to some extent. Or I could just be trying to find a reason for something I like with just grasping at anything and I don't actually know, right? But I think that's like something I've thought a little bit about on my side. But I think it's really hard to, especially when you're a kid, like figure out like what led you to be more interested in like games broadly versus like being very hyper specifically interested in one thing, right? Because as a game journalist, I feel like in some ways you kind of have to be broad, right? That's part of the job to some extent. But I imagine it probably depends. um I'm
yeah,
curious, like education wise, like what did you do to get to where you're today, where you're actually writing about games now? Like what did that path look like for you?
yeah. uh I mean, that's actually like a really good tie-in to I guess me covering like a wide span of like games, right? And my So I have like a lot of I have a lot of quote unquote education in regards. So I spend a lot of time in academia, so that does inform like the way that I go about
Yeah.
games, right?
And
So
sorry, before you get too deep into this, let me also say experience as well plays into this. I think
yeah, yeah,
it doesn't have to be formal education as well, but like personal experiences too. So
yeah. But this specifically, it's like very much tied to my, I guess, like my obsessive compulsion when it comes to, all right, you mentioned like the Wind Waker, for example, right?
yeah.
Let's say that's a game that as a kid I played, right? I didn't have access to a lot of the other Zelda games.
Mm.
I mean, I played the N64 and the other stuff that my friends, let me borrow. But when I got older and I had like more access to video games either through like emulations or stuff that I can like buy myself. It became very much because of like the brain rot that academia gave me. It's like, okay, I have to go to the source. I mean, I do like, okay, so where did this begin? Right. And
Yeah,
like, what
yeah,
are like the changes? Okay, what influenced Zelda? What was been influenced by it? Right.
yeah.
So you go from there and you start playing like the so-called like Zelda clones, the all the weird like offshoots from there, and then you start getting into all right, like designers, like who's part of like this team, and all these like other things, and it branched off from there. Like for me, so I mainly, I've my studies have actually nothing to do with video games, like specifically. I mainly studied economic geography and Latin
Hmm,
American like
hmm.
foreign policy. So it's very different, than but I do try to bring perspectives like that into my reviews as much as I can, if my
the
editors allow me.
the thing I was always told at the time was like at the end of the day for game journalism it didn't really matter what degree you had, it just mattered if you had a degree, which in some ways I think creates a weird diversity of people who can get in because it'd be like I have a degree in like marine biology, now I'm writing video game reviews, right? At the time when I was trying to get into game journalism, that was kind of the sentiment that I generally heard as a whole. I did straight up just journalism stuff, and then at the very last minute, chickened out and went to PR in my last semester because I was just like, oh gosh, how do I make money doing this? So
Yeah, yeah, it's tough. It's a tough, especially now. Yeah, especially now, it's really tough. I think a lot of people, the ones that even the people that you're seeing that are like the most, I guess, like public facing, the ones that have like the biggest platforms, like some of them are barely making like like a living wage,
yeah, yeah.
just off that. So it's definitely a tough, it's definitely a tough like industry.
Yeah. Well, how did you? Because like even when I was getting into it, the thing I generally heard was just like it's not a great industry for making money. Like, what led you from I got all this education doing this other stuff into doing games writing? Like,
Yeah.
what did that transition look like?
Well, so I was, going back to the brain rot of academia, right? And you, there is, I don't know of a single like place, like if we would think of like the university, broadly speaking, as like a place where like people work so much for nothing, right? So like you're writing, especially if you're like in the graduate route or like professor route, like most of the writing they're doing, you're not getting paid for. Like you're writing for like academic journals, you're writing for like all this stuff, and it's like no money. You're just hoping that the right person reads it, or you put that in like your resume, your CV, or what So for like for the next job. So I was already accustomed to this. Is not. It sounds kind of like sadomasochist, but like I was already accustomed to that to a certain degree. But then also I had other jobs where I just wasn't necessarily like happy with what I was doing, even though they made more money. But so I slowly made the transition. So instead of writing about whatever like Latin American like populist movements in like the modern era, I transitioned to writing about Chrono Trigger as like a way of like releasing stress, or dealing through like trauma caused by like the pandemic and things like
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
And just slowly I started like my toes in. You start, and it's not a perfect thing. I wouldn't say, I don't really, it's, I have to be like upfront and it's not like the only thing I do, like because it's not a way. I don't think currently it's really like a way for most people to be able to live, to actually make a living, especially if you're like if you're a freelancer, or even if you're just like trying to like follow a lot of these like the newer like forms of like media, either you're like on YouTube
Yeah.
or you're handling like your blog or your newsletter, it can be very challenging.
I definitely compare like in terms of like YouTube and things like that, at least when people ask me about it, like, oh, why don't you do something on YouTube? I'm like, that's like saying, why don't you just become a rock star? It's like, I don't know if that will ever work out kind of thing. But I'm curious, like when you do, so and try me, what year range? Because you mentioned the pandemic. So were you making this transition during like 2020, like only a handful of years ago, or
Yeah, it's only a handful of years ago.
Um, when you do games writing, do you find those experiences you had with the other writings you've done, or education that had nothing to do with games? Do you find that kind of fits into your writing at all? Like, do you get an influence from any of those experiences you had?
Yeah, I mean, I'm somebody that I try to incorporate like everything that I can like within like reason. So like
Hmm.
I don't like, how can I say this? I don't like waste essentially. Like I don't want to like read something, or I don't want to like write about something in the past and then it's dead, you know? It's just like I all that effort was just there. It's like I go back to themes. I'm constantly reading. I'm living, right? I'm a human being. I have experiences outside of games. Um or even within games, right? Like I might be playing something, but I can refer or compare to like other games that I've played before,
Yeah.
right? And that's extremely useful for me as like a critic, right? If I'm doing criticism, but then also for the reader as well, because I might be describing, like for example, I the one of the last reviews for a video game that I've done was for this this uh this HIO game. I think it's on Steam as well, called 5 years old memories, which is essentially
Mm,
how the best way to describe it. It's essentially like a modern, it's like a modern like take on 1990s like CD-ROM games, but it's not really a game. It's more of like a omnibus of like different like stories that people like retell like their childhood. You could just interact with the images as they're
yeah.
saying a story to then move, to then like progress essentially to it. And through that, I talk about like old CD-ROM games. I talk about art in general, right? Because it is a very picturesque game. So, and it looks like, from first glance, it looks like very like amateur art, like art that you would like paintings that you would do as like a 5-year old with watercolors and everything, right? And then with your fingers. But then you realize, right? And this is part of me as like a critic. It's like, well, there's more to this, right? Because somebody took a lot of time to do this. This isn't just like, I'm just going to just, I'm lazy. This is the only type of paintings that I can actually do and like put like on a screen. It's like there's a tie-in between the look of the game, like the visual aesthetics of the game, and the themes of the game. Um, and I try to draw on things like that. That's one example. You mean, we were talking earlier about a feature that I did for on Winner One Final Fantasy VIII. That
Hmm.
one runs the whole gamut. There's so many influences there. That's like less than 2,000 words, and I talk about like my time living in West Africa as
Yeah.
a Peace Corps volunteer, um, being deadly, about to die. Like I was really fortunate that I survived the
Yeah.
incursion, playing this game, which at the time of its release was like the zenith of like commercial like technology, like media that like you can see when it comes to like graphics on a console. Um, I talk about I, I talk about inequality when it comes to different countries. In
Hmm.
that, I have a lot of references to the novelist uh, Percival Everett, who a lot of people might know through that film that came out last year, American Fiction, based on his book Erasure, which I reference several times. It's like Easter eggs through there. The title of it is actually the title of the novel within the novel of that book, and then also the structure as well. It's also I also took from that. So
That's like a really I don't know, it's like it's a very personal article, I feel like. Is that accurate? Would you say that's an accurate statement? Like it feels like an article that's very much about your experience and you experiencing these different feelings all at once because of being deathly ill, right? And then also you're experiencing like you said with like the multimedia aspect of Final Fantasy VIII, and then you're also in the monkeys coming and stealing your shampoo. It's this very like hectic article about like this what feels like when you read it a very compressed time in your life where just like all this stuff is happening and they're all kind of extraordinary things in this like very brief moment. Is that would you say it's an accurate portrayal of that article?
yeah, it definitely is. And I was
Okay.
talking to the founder and president of the New York Video Games Critics Circle yesterday, Harold
Mhm.
Goldberg, about that, because that article really resonated with him. Um, and it's funny you mentioned that. It is very personal, and it's something that I've been thinking about in my head. Not necessarily the structure, right? Like not the formalist qualities of like the writing, but just
Mhm.
like that, and in relationship to that game, because Philip Salvador, who was the head librarian for the video games, for the why am I blanking on it? Frank Cifaldi's organization,
Yeah, yeah.
not the New York.
Video Game
Um,
History Foundation?
yes, thank you. Not everything revolves around New York, so I should
Yeah.
remember that. So yeah,
actually don't know where they're based out of, but I just I was at Portland
they're in
Retro Game
California.
Expo, so
I think they're like in, if not Berkeley, around like San Francisco area, like the Bay
mhm.
Area. But they, he like released like this like blog on Final Fantasy VIII, because this is the 25th anniversary of the game,
Okay,
and
yeah.
it was him like essentially just raving and sharing some like really cool stuff about the game, and that like really got me thinking, and it kind of like unlocked like that memory. It's like, oh yeah, Final
Yeah.
Fantasy VIII, why don't I think about this game? And I realized, oh yeah, because when I don't know if I'm allowed to curse. I was about
I
to
don't care,
say,
so
I was about to say shit. I'm like, damn, that's that thing that I played like on, yeah. Well, if you read the articles, pretty much like on hallucination through fever dream through hallucination through monkeys harassing me on essentially my deathbed. So
I'm glad you survived, by the way. I'm glad that worked out for you.
I
um,
don't know if I survived, but yeah.
well, you're here today at least. The
Yeah.
ghost of you's here at least. So, um, yeah, so like when I read that article, that feels like a very, in some ways, artistic article to me. But obviously, being in game journalism, to some extent, it's a business as well, right? If you're trying to make money from it, obviously you're diversifying your income through other things, right? It sounds like. But like, how do you think you find a healthy balance between writing something that's like about you personally versus like how you connect that to an audience who would actually consume it, and then also pitching that to a publication? Because a lot of times I feel a little guilty when I tell personal stories because it feels like I'm telling a story about me, and I have a hard time, I think, connecting it to the audience because sometimes I think less about the audience and I think more about me.
Mm,
So
that's a great question, because I think a responsible writer, right, would will always not necessarily write to their audience, but at least like consider what
yeah,
the audience is, right? That you're right. I mean, it can't just be yourself, right? But
yeah.
you have to at the very least like consider that, because that shapes like the tone, that shapes the content.
Yeah. I think
Um,
maybe what I'm thinking of saying this because like when it comes to like how I communicate something, I do think of the audience in that situation because I need to figure out what they need to hear to understand it. But in terms of like an article of interest, I'm gonna kind of make my thing and I'll try to make it fit you as best as possible. But I'm here making this thing. This is a me thing kind of thing. I think
yeah,
that's how I view it, kind of thing. So,
yeah. No, no,
which is very
I
selfish, I feel like, but
well, writing in itself, it's like one of the most selfish things you can do. And I don't mean that as like a negative. It's meaning that you're very much in your own like mind. I mean, there's
Mm,
there's thinking here, which is like low tier, and then there's writing, which is like upper tier of. It's essentially it's like the next level. It's like the evolution of thinking, in my opinion, because that's where you really have to hone in your thoughts, your ideas, and really um that specific article and just like overall, just like my writing as a whole. There's only one place where I write where I really cater like the way that I'm presenting myself to like just like a broader audience, so to speak. And that's when I contribute stuff to like NPR, for example. But that's just because I'm usually just helping with with the roundup of like the best games of like the year, essentially. So I usually have like 100 words if I'm lucky, right? 100 words, so like 120 words like per game, and it's like so I have to like really get to the nitty gritty on that. So that's really every other time when I write for Pop Matters, which is mainly where I write for what I write for like other places. I it's what I want to write essentially. Um, that doesn't mean that I'm not necessarily thinking of like the audience. I'm thinking about the audience for the publication, right? Um, but it's going to be a compromise essentially between what I know the audience expectations are and like their level of knowledge to the topic. Because I primarily write for a publication that most people that read it are either academics, musicians, or people who like independent music, like fans of independent music. Um, so I can't go to town on start talking about processing power and like graphical fidelity,
yeah.
right? I can, but I have to really like hone in and explain it to sometimes to a point that it might take just too much of like the article. So pull it back. So I have to reference other things that I think people might know, right? So hence why I use most of the time it's not even other games, it's other forms of art that I might so my favorite game of this year is Sunrise Visitors 1,000 Times Resist, um which is for those listening, if you're unfamiliar with the game, it's part walking simulator, part like narrative game, but it's really closer to, honestly, the closest analog I can think of. It's not even a video game. It's more of like experimental, like multimedia theater, and um and and that really shows. I mean, and I think it's one of the strongest like narrative experience like in the medium of video games since something like Kentucky, like Route Zero or Disco Elysium. It's just that great. It's just amazing. I actually interviewed Remy Sue, who's like the creative director and founder of Sunset Visitor, yesterday for a podcast for the New York Video Games Critics Circle. So that and it's so when I talked about that game, when it's an obscure game, even though it's starting to get a lot of recognition now, it's definitely not a game that most people like have heard about. Even people that know about games, even myself, when I first, when I was getting like press emails or I was going to like showcases, I dismissed the game up front. I didn't like the look of it. I thought it was, I mean, it just felt to me like, I hate to say this, but almost like derivative in like aesthetic and style to something like the Shin Megami Tensei series, right?
Yeah.
Specifically Shin Megami Tensei 5, which the main protagonist is like dressed in blue, and the main character in 1,000 Times Resist is dressed in blue, and I just felt that I was obviously completely and totally wrong. I'm a moron. Um, for
The
that.
thing I always say is that like and part of this I think is just so much media to choose from these days is that like I will generally be dismissive of your game until there's the one thing that hooks me in, but once you hook me in, the rest of it comes together. So I might be like, oh, you just made like an Assassin's Creed clone, but when I play it once you get in there and you can feel everything, right? You're like, okay, here's all the little decisions they've made. You can start to be like, oh, well, here's what makes this different, and here's like the decisions they made, right? And but like it takes you interacting with it, so but that takes a lot of time, and so you have to like choose if you're going to even decide to give something the appreciation it every game deserves, in my opinion. But are you the person to appreciate it? Maybe that's the bigger question that comes
No,
up.
that's
So,
a great way of saying that because I mean, essentially the reason why I was captivated by it and I fell
mhm.
in love with it wasn't because of my previous experience with video games. Because if I was only, you know, quote unquote a gamer, I
Yeah.
think I wouldn't have appreciated that game as much. But because I love film, I have like all these other interests from that perspective, right? From my knowledge of that, I was able to draw like a line between like, oh, they do this, oh, they do this. It's like, oh, this is amazing. I
Mhm.
haven't seen this before, like in a video game, or at least like done like with this level of like competency, right?
Yeah.
And that that really, that really hooked me, and that's the kind of connections that I try to make when it comes to games, specifically for the audiences that I tend to write for.
Yeah.
Um,
One thing that do you know I was getting mixed up with some actor, Adam Sessler, I think is his last name. He's an old X-Play
Yes,
G4
yes,
guy.
yes. I know that
One thing
obsessed.
that really
I don't know where this is going.
well, I just listened to his podcast like forever ago. I was like working at a Wendy's listening to him. And one of the things that he said on that podcast that really stood out to me was he was just like, you can't be a games writer unless you enjoy other media, which I don't know if that was like a triggering point for me or if I just like I am almost entirely invested in games. So sometimes there are some times in my life where if I get advice, if I feel like it can be done a different way, I'll do it that way instead just to prove it can be done that way. So I like being like, I've never watched The Wizard of Oz, but I'll play the DSJRPG Wizard of Oz
Oh
game.
my god, that
And
game
like,
is so neat. That's
it's
such a
neat.
neat
It's
game.
cute. And I get like the fun perspective of like that is just Wizard of Oz to me, right? And it is kind of like a fun novelty to be like, I don't know One Piece, but I know I've played the Wii One Piece game and stuff. Which I think that's a very like narrow, shallow way in terms of just like, oh, licensed game, I'll play it and appreciate it. But I think there's sometimes where I end up with games where or situations where I feel like I sometimes look at a different perspective on a game because I don't have a lot of like connections to like a greater media culture. Like I don't really listen to music really. I don't really watch movies. I don't really watch TV. I'm like almost entirely invested in video games. And I'm curious if you and like you don't like take this as like hurting my feelings or anything. I'd be curious if you think that is like a negative or a different way to look at it. Because I definitely felt like when Adam Sessler said it, it was like, you need to do this or else you will fail. And admittedly, I'm not a game journalist, so maybe I did fail, right? But I'd just be curious your thoughts on it.
I mean, some people will argue that if you're in this profession, you failed at something, but no, that's not true. That's kind of mean. But yeah, I didn't know I was gonna be have a conversation about Adam Sessler that's gonna be negative. Um,
It's
but
I don't
it
think it's negative.
no,
I
no,
just it
no,
just
no.
made an
I know.
impact on
I'm
me.
just
Yeah,
yeah. No, I mean I agree with him at
yeah,
that. Probably the only thing,
yeah.
but it's yeah. No, I. This is the thing, right?
Hmm.
From my perspective as like a critic, which a critic is a writer, right?
Yeah.
Yes, like you should know. You should have like you should cast a wide net and not just like engage with stuff. Or you should anything that you engage with, you should do it very thoroughly. And
Mm-hmm.
the thing with video games is it's a multimedia art. So a lot of the stuff that video games are built on existed prior to them, or there's video games are always trying to, which I think it's like a horrible mistake, but it's something that keeps going on. It's like video games are always trying to be more like film, or trying to like always like chase this like film prestige nonsense.
Is
And
that still a thing? I might be just out of that space now, but
yeah, I think it still is. I mean, just look at something like the Game Awards, like the structure of the Game Awards, and you know, and even the way that video games are presented when it comes to like trailers, they're very much it's very much like a one to like movies, which is not something that's like interactive.
And a lot of modern games, like Sony stuff in particular, right? That has very like TV show movie overtones to just how it's presented as a whole, maybe.
Yeah, and sometimes I'm glad you brought this up because sometimes too, a lot of times they're making this, especially now, where
Hmm.
you're not just trying to make the game. When you're creating the IP, you're trying to think of, okay, the game comes first, then there's going to be the TV show, there's going to be the movie, right? There's going to be this multimedia property. I mean,
Yeah.
it's essentially like the media mix, right? Like going back talking about like like Japanese like forms of like mass entertainment, right? It's like there's like this plan structure. So when you're making the game, you're already thinking of, okay, how can this be adapted? And this is not just like speculation. This is like something that's actually thought about as like the games are even with pre-production, right? Um, it's so it helps. It really does help in that regard, right? Because look how I was able to mention that. That's because I know, some of like a lot of that other stuff. And just going back to just like the history of video games, and I mentioned the media mix, right?
Hmm.
Specifically, like, well, now this is global, but when something like Pokemon, right, which is like a Japanese like cultural like product like came out, like we've never really seen anything like that. Like when it came to like the States or other parts of the world. Japan had things like that already where you already had, you had the toys, you had the TV show. A lot of that was linked to different, to just different laws of how things can be like marketed to children as
Yeah.
opposed to like it was in the States. But when we got that, that was like a tidal wave. We've never seen, okay, you have a TV show and then that's gonna be you have the game, you're gonna have the trading card game, you're gonna have the movies, you're gonna, all the merchandise. And if you're covering Pokemon, you need to know this stuff. Like it's just like it's just like should be like base information when you're covering the games, in my opinion, because it just helps you. It just helps you really get into the depth of this. Because I remember, and this is like my last note on this. Like a lot of the criticisms on Pokemon games now, the current ones are, it's like, well, they're taking out too many Pokemon out of the graphics aren't very good for them. Which is, I mean, I think part of that is fair, but it's still also like it's like over 1,000 Pokemon now. It takes like it takes a lot of like the amount of like hours and like labor and money it would take to like 3D like animate that stuff, right? It's gotten so big. That's an important. So if I'm drawing that criticism, right? If I'm like, well, I can't, a problem with this game is, the graphics are. I have to know that. I have to. If I'm being like a serious, well intentioned, like critic of that, I have to. I can't just like write that and just say that's like a smart thought. It's like, well, why? Why is it like that? Because I mean, HD video games are among the most expensive things and labor intensive things, like labor intensive in the sense of like hours, right?
Yeah. It's almost like a tech debt, but it's Poke debt kind of thing. Just too
That's
many,
funny.
too many
Yeah.
Pokemon. I think it's interesting to talk about that because like I think when I was asking that question initially, I was thinking about like creative works, right? Like I was mentioning earlier, like I've never watched Alice in Wonderland or I've never watched Wizard of Oz, stuff like that. But I think one thing that I have definitely taken more of an approach to more recently is like, hey, Nintendo like praising like are people praising Nintendo for like raising wages in Japan, right? And they're like, oh, like look, they're paying their employees more. Clearly, Nintendo cares so much about their employees, and people will be like, this is what or what American companies should be doing, kind of thing. But like when you look into like the Japanese economy as a whole, it's like, oh, all wages are raising, and Nintendo did, give them a little more than the average company, but it's
Yeah, I
not
think it was
necessarily something
ten
to.
percent I think it was, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, yeah. It wasn't at least surface level. And I'm not like an economic expert, to be
Yeah.
clear, but it looks like it was basically following that general trend of like Japanese wages needing to rise to keep up with inflation kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean,
So
I'll give them a credit a bit in the regards that, so when they were doing that, there wasn't a law in place. It wasn't like a government mandate. It was more of a it was more based on essentially what you were saying. It's like there's this, things are rising. We Japan has had a chronic issue of just people just making way too little for the cost of living. Um, and definitely, I mean, that's a very like complex economy also too, because though their wages are lower, the cost of living for a lot of things comparably to like the United States, it's actually it's like mind boggling. I mean, I was in Japan over like in July, and talking to like a lot of Japanese folk. I mean, they feel the squeeze on like the higher prices and everything, but they have socialized medicine, for example. Like you can just go to the doctor and you don't have to like here, like in the US, even with insurance, you're like playing like Russian roulette potentially,
Yes.
right? And that's just and that's such a huge, I mean, it's something that a lot of people don't even think about when you're living under those circumstances. But for me as like an American, I'm like, oh my God. And in Tokyo, even though it's a fairly expensive city, it's actually fairly affordable to like to rent by most plans. But Nintendo do that was just like as a context to just like some of the I guess some like the material like financial conditions over there. But Nintendo raised 10%. It's good because one, those people should get paid more.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, I think they should get paid even more than the 10%. But it does follow. I have like a love hate relationship with Nintendo. Um, and that's one of the things that I do respect about them. Is that I don't. It's kind of odd, right? Because it's like it's a very old company, right? And it's one that is also managed very conservatively, not in the ultra like politically charged like way that would. It's just like very much like frugal when it comes to like money. It's you can argue they're very secretive about things. They're not worried about chasing trends, especially not now. Like,
Yeah.
and that's something that I really do like because one of the issues with modern video games is not only because of the horrible like labor practices, it's just like the environmental like destruction and like the resource extensiveness when it comes to just creating these games. I mean, GTA 6, I think it's gonna cost, close to like $2 billion last time I checked, just to make that game.
Mhm.
And you know, we're living in a time where it's getting you start seeing this is gonna get a little doom and gloom here, but you start seeing like the effects of anthropogenic like climate change like in action, and something like video games as they currently stand as like the triple A, or as some like executives want to like from like the quadruple A games, right, are so expensive, require so many resources, um that you need to sell like 40 million copies of a game just for it to like break even or to be considered successful. Nintendo doesn't really do that. Like Nintendo can sell 500,000 like copies of a game, 1 million copies of a game, which is still like a lot. But now that's like, oh, that's like nothing. Like if GTA 6 sells like 1 million copies, Rockstar, I think the whole video game industry will just crash completely.
Do you mind
Um,
if I go a little deeper on what you were saying earlier with specifically Grand Theft Auto 6 connecting that to like climate change specifically? I think when I think of climate change stuff with video games, I think a lot back, I remember when like during the Wii era when they like switched to like eco-friendly packaging and stuff like that, right? What is the connection there that you're looking at? Cuz like I other than like packaging, is it just like the electricity usage? Like what in specific it made that connection for you?
Well, a lot of this is so one of the actual biggest uses of energy I'm talking about, and when I mean, using electricity, it requires like resources. So either, you know, a lot of places are still run by either like coal plants, or you need like massive like of water. Modern computing requires a lot of this. And not only that, it's also the parts needed to make these as well. Like, are you have to get like access to like resource minerals, which you could only get in a few places in the world, and so you have to like extract from that. And you have massive teams for these games. You need to have like massive, you need to just have like massive like databases, massive like like digital storage devices, which that takes like a lot of, it takes like a lot of energy. And games are becoming, it's not just video games. I mean, I'm not trying to like pick on them, but we're speaking about video games specifically here. But it just requires so much, and it kind of mirrors like this path to like self-destruction that like this industry's like in. Not only it's like burning their workers like literally through, through burnout, and just like, mandatory like overtime, then firing, you know most of them like after like a game comes out, or it doesn't meet like expectations. um a lot of studios are just closing. But then also the aspect of actually making these games is also destructive when it comes to the planet. So
It's interesting. Yeah, I've never like thought about large scale releases and connecting that to climate change stuff. But like I think in general, anytime you have anything being produced on a mass scale, it's going to have an impact, right? Not that I'm trying to take the blame away from GTA 6, just why I
yeah,
probably never thought about it like that. One thing, so I went to college, and you went to university. It sounds like, right? Or was there a particular type of school that
I mean, do you want me to like list schools or just be more
or yeah, I
specific?
guess
I
what
don't
I'm just
know.
trying to say is like both of us have been through like educational institution stuff,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, I
Um,
went to community college too. I don't know if that I did 2 years at a community college
yeah,
before
yeah.
I moved on.
Yeah, I did community college. I was in Georgia, so I went to Georgia Perimeter and Georgia State University. So nothing,
Okay.
nothing fancy. What I could afford to get into. um,
No, I understand. I
but
understand.
one thing is like when you look at a lot of game coverage and stuff like that from more traditional outlets and stuff, I do think people kind of associate it with people who are more educated and um, went through college and university and stuff. And one thing, and I think I could be wrong about this. I didn't really start thinking about this until you reached out to me. But I was trying to think of like why I kind of stopped trying to do game journalism, and I'd say probably around like 2015, right when I was graduating school, and I just kind of looked at the environment and was like, how does this actually work in a way that makes sense for me? And having a hard time figuring it out. But I feel like at the time, um, there was like that's when I felt like there was really starting to be a split between like YouTube content creators and like more traditional game journalists and things like that.
Mm.
And I'm curious, like, it's been 10 years since I think I've really thought too much about it. And like, technically, I'm a YouTuber, but like, I don't like identify as a YouTuber, if you want to put it that way. Like, if somebody goes, "Oh, you're a YouTuber," I'm like, I don't call me that. I'm a guy who talks about video games on the internet. But I'm curious if you feel like um, have those two things lived harmoniously? Has kind of that YouTuber influencer culture affected, your work or the people around you in their work? Like how has that separation between those two professions, or maybe they're closer than when I was originally looking at it? Just I guess general comments on how that's impacted your role, I guess.
No, that's a great question.
It's
It's
a very
actually that.
broad question,
No,
sorry,
no,
but
but no, I like it. It's also something that that I think everybody, just like in video games, period, has to like contest with one way or another. Now, I'll just preface this by saying, like, in no way am I trying to be like elitist or anything. It's like, if you, no matter like your educational background or how you feel, if you want to discuss games, write about games, make like a video about games, like, please like feel like empowered, to do it. Um, so I was just speaking like, obviously, like on my own like experiences getting into this.
yeah.
No, the I
Like
think
I don't think my journalism career should have impacted whether I talk about games, right? I think that's maybe something that you're
Yeah.
kind of getting at that, right? Like you don't need the education background
No,
or
you
things like
don't. I
that.
mean,
Yeah.
I know some of the best and brightest like thinkers that I know when it comes to games or like technology are people that haven't even finished college, so or haven't even gone to college. And even if they don't write or discuss video games, like it to me, the folks that I really want to know get the reactions more on, like people that have like almost like no bearing on like when it comes to like modern video games, right? I want to hear like how they feel, like their reactions to these things, right? And it's a game like makes sense to them, right? If you've never picked up a video game before, because that's also a form of education, right? Like, are you like literate when it comes to like modern like video games? And
Yeah.
it's like, can you pick that up and does it make sense to you? But I think YouTube now. It's like it's the forefront. I mean, for better or worse, of just like video games, like media, right? Like, um, I mean, a big like video game video essayist on YouTube, gets more like somebody that got whose videos like watched like 100,000 times or whatever. That's more than most of my articles get read, right? So it's um
Even you were talking about Tim Rogers earlier with we were talking about My Summer Vacation or Boku no
yeah,
Natsumi, and I'd be curious because I think he has written for publications before. I think
yeah,
I've
yeah.
been sent some of his stuff before, and I would be curious, like, what is the discrepancy in the views of his YouTube videos versus articles he put out? I feel like it'd be pretty large, but I could be wrong. I don't get a lot of behind the scenes look at that
No,
stuff.
I
So,
think it is pretty well. He was in some pretty big publications, but I think
mm,
still, I think YouTube is just at this point the most, and streamers as well. We have to like add streamers and like people on Twitch. They like on this equation. They are the most influential voices when it comes to like video games, like tastemakers or just critical, just a critical opinion. I mean, this doesn't necessarily like speak of like quality. There's some that are doing like cutting edge work, others that are just like this is absolutely horrible. But in
yeah.
my opinion, but it is, it is like the modern forum that's like in the forefront. For us, how does it? It really does, because it's like you're writing for stuff, and depending on like where you're writing, it's like, are you even really getting traction? um you know are people even like reading your stuff? That's something that I know a lot of writers like think about. I'm also, even though I write for some middle-sized indie publications, I also write for some like bigger publications, but I'm also very much into like the blogosphere, of whatever remains of that, which I think it is making a resurgence again a bit. I don't. It's never going to be as big as it was, back, in the 2000s, early 2010s. But I keep I'm always like open to that, and it's still not. People are always discussing there. It's like, oh, maybe I should, adapt some of my writings to like a YouTube video, for example. Or even a lot of writers, what they do is, they stream and then they write, right? A lot of publications, they have like they have a Twitch, and that's a way of getting of either like supplementing like your audience, right? Getting like not your audience, or introducing one audience from one side to another, or I don't know though if, I guess my question I have with that is, I don't necessarily think that, and this is all speculative. I don't have anything really to, I haven't done any research on this, but I don't think that they translate well. I think people who watch stuff on YouTube for the most part stay on YouTube. I'm talking about the wider. Well, obviously, there's people that, but what? And then people who read stuff usually read stuff, but I think that's getting smaller and smaller. And just because also just like the video game press as a whole is just shrinking. It's just shrinking more, especially when it comes to like, bigger, just like bigger publications. And a lot of them, the ones that are the most successful, are transitioning from strictly covering video games to becoming wider like media stuff. Like IGN is like a great example, right? They're like the biggest of them, but they cover essentially their brand of like pop culture stuff that they want to cover on there. And they'll have like game stuff, etc. Polygon is making a very aggressive change to this. You know, I've been to that site recently. You have like now they have like a section for selling stuff essentially, right? Like recommendations based on that. Um, and the classic examples Kotaku, but we don't have to get too much into that if you don't want to. Yeah.
I did read some drama about like I mean, I think every website's dealing with like how much are we making guide content versus SEO. I read I'm gonna probably mispronounce it because I always mispronounce this word, Automaton Media,
Mhm.
or
Yeah.
Automata Media. I read them, and I recently was on their website, and they have like a bunch of Silent Hill 2 guide stuff, and I'm like, I don't need any of this, but
No,
you gotta do what you gotta
guides
do.
are guides
Yeah.
are what brings people in. Like for games like publications. That is it. It is guides. That is what people. If people are reading anything, it is guides. So yeah, not having a guides on like your game's website is just you're for lack of better words, you're setting yourself up for like for failure in regards to like just future like longevity.
Do you find any art in making guides, or do you think it's purely utilitarian? We need people coming to the website kind of thing.
Oh, there can be. I mean, there's some very well written guides. I think a lot of this is
Mm.
not so much like what it is. It's just more of like the constraints, right? It's like, oh,
Yeah,
this
yeah,
guy needs to be ready before the game is out. It's
yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
how much time you have with whatever, like a
And
big
I feel
game,
like,
right? Like how much time you're gonna have to
yeah,
write a guide on that.
I feel like also there's like when you're going to a guide, you're there to get a specific piece of information. So there's probably not a lot of room for like the stuff you're talking about, like with Final Fantasy VIII earlier. Like if you're talking about that kind of personal experience, somebody's probably just like, "Where's the wrench though?" in Silent Hill, kind of
Yeah,
thing. So
and
it's a very different reader
it is very
base,
it's
probably.
very different. I know
Yeah.
this is not very common, but I've seen a few games now do it where it makes it very difficult for you to use a guide. Like something
Mm.
like what's it called? Uriel and the Laser Eyes, the Annapurna puzzle game that came out earlier this year. There's like a lot of the puzzles are rearranged like per playthrough. So it's a lot of the key things like you can't really go to like a guide for. You have to actually pay attention. You have to like invest yourself in. I mean, I think that only works because that game is very niche. I mean, there's an audience for it, but it's very specific. I think most, yeah, like it has to be like that formulaic stuff. You go and you get stuck, and it makes sense. I mean, some of these games are like really long. Not everybody's brain is like wired the same way. Obviously, I mean, I definitely use guides like before. I try not to because I'm a sicko, but overall though, but it's completely fine. Now, speaking directly to your question of like video game, like the guides being art. Have you heard of Burmese?
No, I haven't.
So Burmese is it's there's two books and it's by Plastibu, who's this like multimedia artist. Um and they're guides for games for a game that doesn't exist essentially. So
Okay.
yes. So it's So I mean that's it right there, and
Yes,
it's
that is
written
definitely art.
beautifully. It's
Yeah.
written beautifully, like the illustrations are beautifully. So you're reading this, and it's like like the different characters you can be. Like there's maps, there's like descriptions of like the environment, and then you're like, but
It's
it
almost
just
like a
doesn't
game
exist.
design doc in some ways, it sounds like.
It's yeah, that's definitely an example of that. But it's not. Yeah, I would love to. I've thought about that. Just it would have to be a shorter game, just because of just like time's sake. But do something where I write. A lot of the early new games criticism stuff was kind of like that though. Like where you would have like this like experiential like description of you playing a game, right? So you're
Yeah.
talking about like that specific, and you can just and you're speaking to the game, but then it'll flip back and forth between the game, what's happening in the game, and then like the person as like they're playing it, right? I mean, some of that stuff is more successful than others, but I mean, yeah, when it works, it's definitely very, it's very captivating. Um, but no, it can be done, and it can be. It's hey, I've there's I've read some manuals for like technical stuff that I thought, oh damn, this is like freaking well written and stuff. Or well, look at like instruction manuals for video games, for example. There's some ones that are like, it's like, oh, this is awesome. Like the looks of them, like the presentations of them, like they're telling you like how maybe they use like a different voice, maybe it's like a character in the game telling
Mhm.
you like telling it's like, okay, this button does this and like makes this it engages you like in a different way than just it's like, okay, a button is for this, this is
Yeah.
that.
It's its own piece of literature in a lot of ways because
Yeah.
it creates uh or at least integrates it into the world a little bit more maybe. And like I don't know, I've never really engaged with like modern day manuals. I know there's a game called I think Tunic that had like a
Mm,
manual that was integrated in the game. But I feel like today I don't really look even games that do include manuals because like a limited run thing or something like that. And I don't think I've really looked at it. But for old games, I definitely have spent a lot more times in manuals now
yeah.
because a lot of times I'm finding games just like there are things about them mechanically I just kind of need to know. And I do
Well,
get to appreciate a lot of older manuals at least. So, but
speaking of manuals, so I have here electroplankton, which is
oh
a
yeah, I
US
love
game.
electroplankton.
Yeah, and the manual on this is just it's I mean, it's beautiful. Sorry
Yeah,
for
yeah,
people who are just listening
just
to this.
listening.
But
Yeah,
there's like these like comics. It's just like
yeah,
it's
yeah,
amazing. I mean, and essentially this is somewhat of a because this is such a simple game,
yeah,
right? That essentially just telling you how to play is the guide, essentially.
yeah,
And
yeah.
it's it's fantastic. Yeah, I really want to see more stuff like that. I mean, a lot of people are making stuff like that. I think the issue now is, time, just like our frail bodies and short life expectancies, right? It's just like so many games, and it's there's just so many things. And even somebody like me who's like, I get hundreds of like emails, like press release stuff. I know like what's going on, and I just miss so many games.
I mean, I spend my entire life thinking about video games, and I'll be honest with you, probably about 70% of the video games you've said today, I'm just like, I don't know what that is. But, it's just, especially anything in the last like 10 years, like just a lot of indie stuff in particular. I need to be better about it. I need to go on Steam. I started Steam wishlisting stuff to try to be better about like remembering things because I'll look at a game and be like, oh, that looks neat, and then I'll never see it again because it's just gone, right? And so if I Steam wishlist it, at least some point in the future, there's a potential that I might actually play one of these indie games that get announced and I never ever see ever again, kind of
Yeah.
thing. But um, you did mention earlier that like game journalism is shrinking, um, or at least that sounds like what you were saying. Like, what do you think is most lost from the field shrinking in terms of like a commentary or yeah commentary, I guess, environment about video games? That I guess in some ways you can maybe position that as like what influencers and things like that might have a harder time replicating because there are like scripted YouTube videos that I think overlap with that a bit, but
Yeah.
I think a lot about like streamers and maybe more reactionary stuff where people are like commentating about games off off the cuff basically. So
Yeah, there's some good videos on that. There's a few like reaction people that I really like. What's it, the happy console gamer? I
oh
love
yeah,
his
yeah.
stuff a lot. But overall, that's a great question. I think mostly I'm gonna be extremely cynical here. It's that I think a lot of that, a lot of the stuff that we're seeing like on YouTube and streamers less so because streamers like they tend to like really either like ultra like open world games or really like obscure games, and that's what they like
Mm,
try to push. But a lot of it is based on the relationship that the influencer has with the publisher, like developer of the game. So you're not gonna get oftentimes you're really not gonna get a lot of I'm saying critical in the sense of like really like piercing like
someone's
like
not going to say
discussion.
GTA 6 is going to destroy the climate kind of thing. Like probably not going to fly if
Not
you're on
most
a
likely.
like, you know, if
Well,
you're on a influencer. Well,
well,
I don't want to
yeah, the
say too
issue.
much, but you know.
But the well, the issues with climate change are so broad that that one
Yeah.
game, even as big as GTA 6 are, the cost of it. But yeah, it doesn't
But
help.
if like GTA, if or Rockstar's giving you like primary treatment, and then you're like giving them a hard time about climate change, you
Yeah,
know, I think as a, I mean, we're both speaking as not in that role. I think so. We have,
yeah,
I think, a very specific view, but it
that
would
is true.
be
That is true.
more difficult to push back against something like that. Where I feel like in game journalism, the expectation is that you are going to push back in that situation,
Well,
right?
supposed to be. I know there's been some instances of that, and it's haunted the space. But I think a lot of the criticism that comes from a lot of people is like, oh, accountability in games journalism, blah blah
Mm-hmm.
blah blah. It's like actually, if you look at like the YouTube and streamer space, there's like none of that
Yeah.
really. Like like that's rampant there. And it's not like I'm not saying that it's like a personal. I mean, you have to do what you have to do. I know for some people that's like their livelihoods, and it's not. But if you're looking at it from the perspective of, okay, I'm going to this person because either I appreciate their perspectives or they're looking at this from, as I was saying before, like more like a piercing like angle. Not saying that you're going to be like negative about the game, right? Or you're going to rave about it, but you're going to provide context essentially. And I think that's what criticism really at its core, what it provides, the reader is context to it. At its highest level. Now, if you just want like a consumer review, which is fine, right? You just want to know like, okay, how does this game run? On the console. What should I expect? Am I going to like this? That's fine. There's room for that as well. But overall, like criticism as something that provides like context as an art, right? And I'm saying this comparing it to other folks that work in criticism in other mediums, right? It's either like book reviews, etc., or like films. That's I mean, and that's where I come from, right? I come from that specific vein. So, as I said before, I'm not going to be, if you are trying to find, like the graphical fidelity. Like sometimes I play games on like the worst graphical fidelity, like on my PC. I'm playing the new Atlas game, right? Metamorph right now, and it's like I'm running that on like the lowest possible like fidelity and performance that I can get on that. I don't think I'm definitely not gonna review it. Maybe I'll write something about it in the future, but
I feel like you could get some angry comments from people of just like you didn't appreciate it to its fullest or something like that, right?
I mean,
You talk about the accountability thing earlier. Like I
that's
feel
an
like
argument, but yeah.
personally, can I say something?
Yes, yes, you may.
So and maybe this is like a bad thing to bring up, but I was kind of getting about early about like 2015 when I was like kind of getting out of games stuff or like that era. Maybe not the timeline doesn't line up, but do you remember that whole like Gamergate thing?
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
I I got really fed up with pretty much all that stuff at the time. I just was not interested in the conversations that were happening related to that personally. I just and like I don't know if I had like a healthy mindset or unhealthy mindset about it, right? But I think what I found looking at Gamergate and people who are like demanding accountability is that people only want accountability if it informs that they're right. They don't care if it's saying that it's like if it's not reinforcing their worldview kind of thing. And so I had a lot of trouble because like game journalists and stuff to me, I think like they're all just doing their best and like I knowing what they're getting paid and stuff. I'm like, there's not a lot of place for like there to be. This does not seem like a field where you're like, getting rich off this, right? It was really challenging for me to kind of like understand that whole thought process of like people being like, oh, game journalists are like gaslighting you or something like that, right? It's just
Yeah.
like so weird. And like I think that's like my struggle with that whole thing was just like this feeling that like this is not about really about accountability. It's just like I And I feel like to some extent this is like where a lot of like influencers ended up coming from, or like it felt like it was just like that challenging of like institutional authority and stuff like that, and like that mattered more than anything actually being said, I think. So like when you said accountability, that's the thing that like triggered in my head immediately. Like I remembered that it was like one of the most frustrating things for me was just like the conversations didn't feel real at that time. They just felt like it was just people being angry for the sake of being angry. I'm sure some people would push back on that if I were to talk to them about it. I assume you probably would not push back on that, but at least to me, that's like how I felt about that whole situation. And I feel like today some of that still exists, and I don't feel like that really exists with game journalists, but I feel like it exists with like influencer culture still. Um, and I am in a
Right.
very fortunate position where I've just kind of pushed those people out of my purview as much as possible. I'm like, I don't really want to watch your stuff. Sorry. I want to talk about, interesting conversations, but that also, yeah, I don't know. It is a weird situation for me back then. And I think that also is like, I was like, if this is what games journalism talk is going to be going forward, I don't want to be a part of this.
Yeah, no,
So
that was a tough. Yeah, that's definitely a tough time. I stopped playing video games entirely around that time too, just because it was just so. I I, I think you your description was pretty like on point. It every nobody was really saying anything. It was just like a lot of it was like very like bad faith like stuff, and I don't really understand. I To this day I don't really understand what this whole like the whole like accountability thing. I know about it very well. I know a lot of friends that were like affected by that. But it's definitely a dark time, and yeah, some of that hasn't gone away. I mean, you're seeing that this year with a few like controversy surrounding like some games. And yeah, there's definitely specific spaces that still like thrives. And that's become a lot of people's identities too, like back then, and then now it's like, now you're starting to see like DEI games or like all this stuff that people are talking about.
yeah,
It's just like this. It's it's like, look, if you don't like the game, just don't play. There's like hundreds of thousands of video games. If you don't like it, like play something else. If you don't agree with the person's like take, just move on. But I'm saying this like, but this is the internet, right? It's like that never
everyone
happened.
has their own view of it. Yeah, and like especially when it comes to like I saw there's like a list. It might have been called the woke game
Oh
list, and
my
I'll
gosh,
be honest, I
that's so
never looked into
hilarious.
it to see if it was real. Maybe it
You
was
need
someone
to.
making a
You need
parody.
to. You need to just.
I
You
don't
need
want to
to.
know.
You need to do it so you can laugh.
I
So
saw
you
like
can laugh.
Alan Wake 2 features a black protagonist. Like, I don't need to look at this list. I'm like, I'm good.
All right, that's smart. It's no,
um,
it's funny. It's funny. Me and
but
my friends, we sat down and we looked at that and we were just laughing.
it's weird that like a community gets built around that, and in some ways it's like a positive thing gets built out of a very negative thing. I think
Oh, I
it's like
see. You
they are
mean like people
getting,
coming together over
yeah, they're
this?
like
Yeah.
they're gathering together about this particular thing, and everybody in that environment feels good about it, and they're working together. They're feeling like they're having an impact, right? And like on paper, without the end goal in mind, that all sounds good. But then once you see like what they're doing, it's like, oh, uh, it's like not so great. And again, I haven't looked into it, so I shouldn't say too much about it. But that was my
Yeah.
initial impression. And I saw the screen cap. That's not doing research, right? Like whenever you see a screen cap, you should make sure it's actually good. But it sounds like you've done some looking into it, so I feel a little
Yeah,
bit
no,
better
I've looked into
there.
it. I've
But
I've even written
yeah,
about adjacent stuff this year
yeah,
about that. So it's definitely, well, it's just something that's just like pernicious. It's just like ever like occurring when it comes to like
yeah.
video game like fandom. And I think like fandom like in general. Um, you
And I think
know,
that stuff existed before, but I think the tools out there to
yeah,
like
yeah.
have an impact are very different now.
Yeah,
So
you can have like direct access to like the like through the internet, like with people that
yeah,
you like. I don't know, you hate. I'm guessing you have to hate to like go through like all that effort to do all that stuff, or
yeah.
I don't know. It's definitely, yeah.
It's weird because they're like, oh, keep politics out of games, but then it's like what you're doing is kind of shoving your politics into games. Is
People
what it
don't.
feels like.
Yeah,
But
people just don't. Whenever somebody says that, I already know. It's like this person has no idea what politics is.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think the thing that I kind of says, I will be honest with you, like when I was younger, I think I was definitely kind of like, I don't think about politics and games much, right?
Hmm.
And whether that was like a, in my eyes, looking back then, I think I at times truly did not see politics in games. But I think as you start to learn more about the world and start learning more about the people who work on games, you start being able to see that like people put themselves in games, right? And that's going to be your worldview and stuff, right? And then so ultimately what happens is your worldview gets integrated into games, whether it's, and part of people's worldview is politics, I feel like, right? And that's just like it's a natural thing, right? That stuff gets integrated into games. So I need to do, there's somebody I want to reach out to at some point about politics and game coverage, because they specifically say they run a website with no politics in games. And what I've seen of the site, the content seems pretty fine. So I'd be very curious what the thought process is behind that and how they determine what's a politics in game and not.
Yeah.
Assuming it's a okay, I need to read more of their stuff, but assuming that's like an okay platform, and it's not somebody who's like offensive. But
Yeah. No, that sounds fascinating. Yeah, because I would. Sounds like the writing would probably be either like very like
review driven or something like that.
yeah like very much. I mean, you can probably like a digital foundry like take on it, but I mean, you can argue and going back to like the climate change stuff, it's like if you're just talking about specs and then knowing it doesn't even matter if like the individual's like ignorant on like the actual like impact of that. And I'm not even saying like ignorant like as like a diss on the person, like you just don't know, like, right, like you just don't have like any like you just actually don't know about that.
I've
It's
been that
like
person before, so I try to give people the benefit of the doubt
yeah,
of just like it's hard to see. Like I didn't know Final Fantasy VII was about environmental stuff, but when I look at it today, it's like, oh, absolutely.
yeah,
Like just
it's
I
very
got
boring.
older.
Yeah, that's a
So
that's like a perfect example of that. It's like, they remade that this year. Well, the new because they've been making
yeah,
this for like a while now, but like the second installment on like in the remake with Rebirth. And
hmm
it's like you it's fascinating. It's like it's based on like it's essentially like this like environmental like fable where you're like making this game where you're just like how many like trees were like burnt like while you the making of this process to like run like these like compute, right, like Japan uses so much like coal and everything, all this like coal that was like used to make this, right, and the same for the first game too, right. I mean, and that's not taking anything away from it as like it's like a piece of art, I mean some of the best stuff actually is created like in that like contradiction, but that
I
contradiction
used
in
to
itself
joke
is
that
like political.
that when you talk about politics with games is that people would be like, oh, the company is trying to push a narrative. And I'm like, Square Enix will absolutely sell you a Hummer, Final Fantasy VII branded Hummer, if they could. Like they're
Well, they'll
going to do
definitely push a Hummer, and
that.
I think one of the things where people usually talk, this runs adjacent to that whole like censorship malarkey that people like push like online. That's it's like, oh, they like censored it to like U.S. release. Like Japanese publishers do the same when it comes to when it comes to like games. I mean, there's just like that's what I mean. What me as like a critic to provide like context, right? Because what a lot of people don't know here, like in the US, it's like when a lot of games, American games, are released in Japan, their censored things are taken out. Like Grand Theft Auto San Andreas is like a great example of this, where they've removed so much aspects of the game where that it essentially became like unplayable. Like you couldn't like a lot of the stuff that people like engage with and played with like there, like you couldn't you couldn't do there was like nothing related to drugs on there. All the cops were like overpowered. As soon as you committed anything that's like a crime, the cops would just show up. You couldn't do a lot of the things associated with the game. So like you would just walk around, take a red light, boom, it's like 300 cops that like are like all of them are RoboCop, and it's
It's
like
kind of
why
interesting.
is
You almost create a new game in that environment, I feel like.
yeah, it does. It's like yeah, but but that's letting you know it's like, go. It's just like a very one way
Yeah.
talk, and I mean, it's disingenuous. It's like, are you actually speaking to this, or you're just like trying to? A lot of this, yeah, let's like be honest. A lot of this is just like the echo chamber, and also either people are actually getting like they have like a fan base, and ad revenue that comes from like covering like these like sensational like BS, or they just like the clout, like people paying like attention to them. That's why that really is. If somebody was saying that and nobody was paying attention to them, they weren't getting any like financial ruination or anything. That would just be dead. Nobody will talk about that, right? I mean, a few people will because people are weird, but it's like it just wouldn't have like the traction that it has now. And the reason why also it's getting pushed to hyperdrive is because it is political. It's like people stake their identity on this and they see that it's like something wrong, regardless of what one thinks if it's, right or wrong or whatever. It's like they think that it's wrong and then they essentially go on these, on these like, virtual crusades, like on this, like trying to push this, and it's like, part of me obviously is like very dismissive of this, but it's hard not to be, but it's also a little scary too. It's like there's just so much stuff going on in life. Like it's like go touch some grass.
Yeah, interact with, I think, different types of people. I think that's super helpful as well, because I think when you get in these like little echo chambers, there's only so much variety you're going to get. I know we've been kind of talking negative mostly up into this like recently, like when we're talking about game journalism and it's shrinking and stuff like that. Do you? I have a very pessimistic outlook on the game journal, just as a heads up, not as individuals working in it, but as a ability to support people to do good game journalism. I think the field just doesn't feel like it's capable of doing that. You mentioned earlier to me that like you're doing a variety of work to kind of like help
So
with that. What do you think is? Let me put it in two different categories. This. What do you think is like something good that you think is probably on the horizon with game journalism? And then what would you like to see, whether it actually is realistic or not? Where would you like to see it go as well?
something good. I think the people there's just some great writers going on there. I mean, even if the circumstances change, and I mean, also just to be frank, it's like if there might not even have like the same jobs with the same level of like security that they had before. I mean, you still have people like you have like Brendan Sinclair, who was formerly at GameIndustry.biz. He's now at On Losing Writer, and he's still writing his stuff, which is like amazing. Like it's and just anything that he comes up with. He's somebody that I always like read. I think now because everything's becoming less centralized, right? A lot of like the big places have folded. People from those have branched off and are able to do things that they weren't able to do for whatever reason. I mean, we're talking about Tim Rogers, for example. Right now, he's not he's making his own stuff now. He's like he works for like himself. He's his own boss, and I mean, you see like the result of that. Um, and a lot of other folks are doing similar stuff, and I think in any situation of crisis, which I think games journalism is. I think journalism in general is like it's just going through a lot of stuff here and just like globally. It's you start. It's an opportunity too for folks who you see that you have places like Critical Distance, which like archives and highlights some of the very best like writing going on now, like ranging the gamut from like the big websites and a lot of just like a small blog that you just never heard of. It's like, oh my gosh, like they like covered this. This is amazing. You know, it's there's still I think as long as there's like people that are passionate and like love this stuff, you're always gonna have something to look forward to. Um, and I guess to your second question, which um, what do I think it's actually gonna be? I think you're just gonna see more of
The second question was more of like, what would you like to
what
see
I
to
like to
support
do.
the
Yeah.
field? Yeah, rather than what
No,
what is
I
realistic kind of thing.
yeah. No, I mean, I think what I like to see more. I mean, I'll just be like the most like fantastic and like idealistic on this. Like, I would just like to these spaces for people to write or make videos or on games, like just like exists without it just being so tied, not necessarily to like making money, but just like so like profit driven. But right, obviously, like you want to like have something that is actually that's like sustainable like financially, so you can pay folks and you can like have like operation costs are getting met. um but
Do you feel like maybe what you were talking about earlier with like in the education field, getting paid to do stuff there? I mean, obviously, you're not making a ton of money, but to help support people, do you think there's a room for that? Well, I don't know. There might be that stuff in games in schools already. I feel like I don't see a lot of game
I mean,
journalism
there's
as courses in schools kind of thing. So,
well, not games journalism, but definitely video games are something that it's like, excuse me, part of like all major university curriculums, right? Especially, I
yeah,
mean,
maybe
you can
writing
take
about games
classes on that.
specifically. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it's that's something. I think you just have to get really creative now. Like, like a lot of models that you have a lot of people do where it's like you write, you're on YouTube, you're also like a streamer. I mean, that's great, but then that's also like, are you working too much? I mean, I guess hopefully if somebody enjoys it, and right, if you love what you do, you don't have to work a day in your life, that type of thing. But I mean, currently, what I think it should be, I think people in games journalism I think we should like get together more, in the sense of like providing like places for where people can write. Um, like if us that like have the means of like if we like run like a website or anything, you can you reach out to folks that that are going through like a tough time, or you just want you like their work, but like in the current like situation they could only write a specific type of article, or they're stuck writing guides. You reach out to them and it's like, hey, let me like commission this from you, right? And you give them, obviously pay them like um if, and or just like get together for like, I'm part of like an organization in the New York Video Games Critics Circle where we do something in the rights of like we highlight writers. I mean, it's very regional specific, but it's still something where it's like somebody that's working like within like the area. It's like this is somebody you know who who we respect their work, but more importantly, it's a place where if you're a newer critic and you have access to speaking to somebody that has like more experience, and that helps. Maybe that's a networking thing as well. I mean, some would argue that might be like creating like cliques, which is which has been like an issue when it comes to like New York's like games writers, for example, or just like the whole like space in general. Like if you're pitching to a specific place, I think it's a double edged sword though, because you kind of need that. I In like an idealistic way, you do need that. It becomes dangerous though when it becomes like a closed group, right? And it's not. You should always be welcoming. That's why I always like try to, I always like on the lookout. I read other people's stuff. I like look. I never scoff at anything specifically. Like it's like I look at it, I read it. I might not like it afterwards, but I try to give it, the time of day, and then I remember, it's like, oh, this person here, and then and then some, I might reach out to them, and it's like, hey, I would like to like collaborate, or it's like, or I even just like like, hey, good work on this that you've, great work on what you've written. I know that I mean, it's something, but I think it is pretty dire. I think like the situation. I mean, just to keep it short and just to summarize, it's like, yeah, people just they need to like get together and actually like try to like form like like organizations, or just like networks where where we like help like uplift like each other. Because it's not always gonna be like this. There's gonna be the video game is just so massive. It's so important economically, that there's somebody's always going to want somebody to write about it. I mean, I don't know how necessarily that's going to be like with the content that they want, but it is that's always going to be a thing. And I think a lot of these places that are going that have gone under are places that you know they had they followed a lot of older models, and whoever's in charge doesn't like really know the industry.
So I think rarely does like any one person get like, help from just an individual, but I'm curious who would you say off the top of your head helped you most, and like what was the best way that they helped you when you were getting started?
Who helped me most?
And it doesn't have to be an individual either. Maybe I should
Yeah, yeah.
disassociate that and say how were you do you feel like you were helped to help you get to where you are today?
I mean, honestly, a lot of this was a lot of my early like help were people that weren't in the games industry but other writers, right? Um, you know, obviously like my editors at Pop Matters, and then also places like Critical Distance as like not only as like a place to follow like what's being written and by who, but then also as like a community itself, I think has been like integral. Um, I mean, like growing as like a writer and like, getting like situated in like specific places. It's I mean I'll be frank, it's a tough place though because like you get in and it's like a lot of a lot of pitching and stuff. I was lucky that I already had like a background as like a writer like in specific like other fields, so it wasn't as intimidating as I know it is when one like first starts, right?
Yeah, it's a change of beat essentially, where you're changing topics more so than you are changing like actual careers in some
Yeah,
ways.
and to a certain degree, at least like initially, like and depending on what I'm writing, I felt like it's like less strenuous because I'm not, I don't have to, you know, I'm not doing the same. I mean, like I said before, like I was like writing like stuff that's like pretty like heady stuff in regards to like the amount of like research you have to do, and and it's something that like you definitely have to have like the facts like right, at least like I feel that like I had to, right? It's not so much like opinionated as a
Mhm.
lot of like criticism can be.
When so you mentioned it a few times now, but you do work with the New York Videogame Critics Circle, I believe is the full name, right? Um, when you how did you get involved, and like what were you hoping to accomplish and getting involved with them?
Well, that's just me essentially like living by what I preach essentially. I was talking about like building like communities. I found out about this organization, you know and I reached out and I was lucky enough to like get in after like a while. And I mean, that's really it. I mean, I've always been like proactive when it comes to things. If I feel, if I feel that, it's a place that, you know, I can belong, I can contribute, I try to make myself available. Um, what I've gotten from there, I mean, it's a lot of like, I think it's opened a lot of doors just having that, and people know about it. I think just because we have like a yearly award, we have a lot of the people who are in the circle are are long time like critics. I mean, past members also, who have like a lot who are very like successful like in the field. Um, so that's definitely adds like a lot of like people or places or organizations that wouldn't like take me as serious. They see that and they're like, oh, it's like, and then I have like their ear.
What
So
do you feel like you like add to that group overall? Like your personal expertise, do you feel like you add anything for them, or
yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm definitely, I'm definitely a unique critic in a lot of sense. Not saying that because I mean, there's like great critics there. Incredible writers. A lot of them much better than me. Adam, but I essentially write what I want, which is like a luxury that a lot of folks don't. So you just get articles from me, and like that you just wouldn't really get from a lot of people like in the circle just based on that. And it's not, and that's just like the conditions, not because they aren't able to, produce that like within like their own abilities. It's just, you your job might demand like specific things and you going to do that. Yeah, I was for that Final Fantasy 8 article. I I was talking to like the editors there, and and they were okay. They were just like, "Hey, yeah, that's we're game," and it's like, well, it's fine, And the same stuff with my Pop Matter stuff. It's like I'll write and I'll just like reference, I'll talk about a game about the first commercially released video game in Cuba, which which is savorless, which a lot of publications didn't really like cover. I covered it, and I used it to just talk about, you know, the Cuban Revolution, like most of the time. Like that wouldn't be like in a game review, like I'll just talk about the game and maybe like some anecdotes, but not like entire paragraphs on like, the history of like political like repression in Cuba and how that like affects like the, game on there, like quoting like academics, some of them my professors. So it's like, yeah, I'm very fortunate.
Something I'm incredibly guilty of is making a lot of assumptions about people and their intentions based off very little information when it comes to video game content, right? A good example of this would actually using an example from this podcast, when Luis mentions like Grand Theft Auto 6 in the context of like global warming, my initial thought about that is like, oh, that's a really odd connection to make, right? And if I just saw that as like a Kotaku headline or something, I'd probably just be like, Kotaku being Kotaku, and just kind of like move on from that, right? But in this case, I had the luxury to kind of ask Luis, like, why make this connection, right? And, in my interpretation of this, of what his response was basically, you're taking kind of this like human accelerated crisis, right? And you're relating it to video games in a way that hopefully connects with the community in a way that they can understand. And obviously, the one thing he mentioned was like, this is not something that's specific to Grand Theft Auto 6, but Grand Theft Auto 6 is like a cog in this machine of an issue that he wants to like highlight, kind of thing, right? But one thing we did talk about is like with content creators who are not typically in kind of the game journalism space and don't necessarily have the exact same standards and expectations and kind of things like that. And I have to ask myself, like, am I giving them the benefit of the doubt, right? We talked about the idea that like, okay, some people are going to be doing it for clout, some people are going to be doing it for ad revenue, some people are going to be doing it to find like acceptance in their community and things like that. And really, the answer is, for most of those kind of things, I don't really actually know with these people. I don't know what their intentions are. I don't know what they're doing. I just kind of see this headline thumbnail or something about them making some claim. I'm like, oh my God. And I think I just kind of assume they're not doing something in good faith and immediately kind of discount their opinion and things like that, right? And I'm not saying that I need to fully explore every single, comment that I disagree with, right, all the time. But I think there's a lot of space for me to be a little bit more considerate to people, giving them at least a moment to kind of provide more context for exactly why they think that's something that's like really important to highlight. And even if they are, kind of latching on to concept ideas and strategies and things like that I think ultimately can be harmful and can be negative. I think part of the challenge, and if you've ever been in a space like this, like when I wanted to be a game journalist, right, is like, where do you find your ladder to the next step? Because this whole video game conversation thing is so strange and like disoriented and like extremely underfunded and undersupported, right? The ladders of where you're trying to go, they can be really hard to find. And so when you find something that might be negative, you sometimes are willing to take that step because it is the thing that might put you to go forward. And if it succeeds, why not take the next step, right? And again, that's not necessarily saying that people have ill intentions in doing that, but like, I think when you don't have these clear directions or clear paths on how to succeed, I think some people are going to start being willing to take these steps that might have negative associations with them. I think everyone as a whole, including myself, does good and bad things, right? And we all have different intentions, and some of these intentions are very selfish that kind of undermine other people, and then some of these intentions are generally pretty good. And I think overall, as all humans are, I think we're a mix of these things, and trying to like figure out, from afar, it can be really hard to giving them the benefit of the doubt you need to give to a human fully exploring kind of like what they need. I think providing ladders to people and providing ways for people to progress their careers and things like that is something that I think can be incredibly important for making sure that people are taking the right steps, they're taking positive steps. So things like the New York Videogame Critics Club, I think, can be an incredibly valuable resource for people to kind of like to try to find those things. One thing I don't think I really emphasized here is that a lot of like pretty big name people contribute to this organization, with like Reggie Fils-Aimé being involved, and there's speakers like from Phil Spencer and all these like fairly large name people who are willing to kind of share their insights and things like that. And that may not necessarily directly translate to like a game degree in journalism or something like that, right? Like, not that that's something that really exists, and as we talked about with Luis today, may not really be something that's like feasible anytime in the near future. But I think these kind of organizations can help you understand where you need to go next, and also kind of help you with how to kind of like parse through games, right? Like, a few things that I think Luis mentioned that I think was like really interesting was this idea that like when you're writing, you're like thinking on a different level, right? Like, he called it like the evolution of thinking, right? And for me personally, that's the time when I really challenge my ideas as well, where I say, I have this feeling, I am going to make this statement, and like, how true is this statement, right? And so I hope like organizations like this can help people like kind of get to those steps sooner and start making like healthier decisions that hopefully help them not only, in parsing their favorite video games, right? Like, for me, 20 years of trying to figure out why do I care about Love and Berry, that's kind of one thing. But I think also this stuff can be really helpful in helping you parse a lot of other different things in life. And I think that's like one thing that, Luis seems to be doing really well, is kind of leveraging his experiences to kind of like better connect video games and how we talk about video games with the world and ultimately kind of people as well, kind of thing, right? One thing that he said that didn't show up in the show is that he kind of talked about the fact that he really wants to kind of like broaden the reach and space of a conversation around a game. And I think that's something that I also like really want to do, right? I think that's why I really focus on like highlighting these kind of like underserved perspectives, whether they be perspectives I hold or, trying to find other people who hold those perspectives as well. So anyways, that was a big, long, rambling rant there, but I think what I'm saying is that like I need to be more considerate to people, and I think Luis helped me see a little bit more of that. You want to see more of Luis though? Look, we got links in the description of all the things we talked about today, his Wind Waker article, his Final Fantasy VIII article, and also while Luis doesn't specifically run it, the New York Video Games Critics Club, I really highly recommend you check out those interviews and things like that. And if you are in a financial position to do so, donate. Look, I'm going to do it right now. All right, we're going to go to the website, going to click the donate button, New York Video Game Critics Circle. We donated money. I'll click donate. All right, PayPal's up. Money in, donated. Wow, it was that easy, guys. So easy. I did it at the donate now. There we go. So easy, guys. We did it at the end of a podcast. So quick. I think it is kind of important to support groups like this, and I really respect Luis for contributing. And, obviously, if you are somebody who can contribute in a meaningful way to this group, I would highly recommend you do so. There's so many people out there making content and things like that. It's hard to know, like, exactly where your money should go to. But I think, at the very least, donating to an organization that's aiming to help kids kind of, better understand and explore the ways they communicate about games, I think that is only an investment in kind of hopefully the future of this space, as dire as it feels. So yes. Anyways, thank you again for Luis for coming on, and check out, it's a lot of links, so check them out.